What's up guys, Anmol here for TechLekh, and in this video we'll be looking at some of the major differences between the Huawei P20 Pro and the iPhone 8 Plus. Now these devices have a similar price tag, and by that I mean the 8 Plus costs 12,000 more than the Huawei P20 Pro and are among the best available smartphones right now. And I think this comparison is going to be really interesting because we're putting up the second best iPhone against one of the best Android smartphones of 2018. So let's get started. Starting off with the display, the one on the P20 Pro is a 6.1 inches screen, whereas the iPhone 8 Plus has a slightly smaller 5.5 inches screen. The screen on the P20 Pro is an AMOLED screen with a screen resolution of 1080 by 2280, whereas the screen on the iPhone 8 Plus is an IPS LCD screen with a screen resolution of 1080 by 1920. Now, keeping aside the technicalities, display on both of these devices are good. The AMOLED panel on the P20 Pro has deeper blacks and vibrant color, whereas the IPS panel on the iPhone 8 Plus has more natural and muted colors. Among these two displays, it will come down to your personal preference, but I do prefer the P20 Pro for it has the vibrant color and a slightly more sharper display at 408 ppi. Moving on to the build and design with the P20 Pro, you get a metal frame with a glass panel on the front and back. It feels very solid and looks premium as well. With the iPhone 8 Plus, you are also getting a glass back with an aluminum frame, but the iPhone 8 Plus design looks really boring. Let's say it's not exciting compared to the P20 Pro. And talking about the water resistance, both of these devices have an IP67 certification. Design is subjective and comes down to your personal preference, but the P20 Pro is much more appealing. Even with a bigger display, the P20 Pro has a smaller body and thus it is much more easier to handle than the iPhone 8 Plus. Of course, the P20 Pro has a notch at the top, but I've got used to it and it feels very normal these days. Now moving on to the internals, the P20 Pro comes with Huawei's own Kirin 970, whereas we have a brand new Bionic A11 chip on the iPhone 8 Plus. In terms of RAM and storage, the P20 Pro has a 6GB of RAM and 128GB of internal storage, whereas the iPhone 8 Plus has 3GB of RAM and 64GB of internal storage. The A11 chipset on the 8 Plus is definitely more powerful and has better scores on the benchmark, but you'll never feel that difference in real-life performance. Games run equally smooth on both of these devices, but slightly heavier games like PUBG look smoother on the 8 Plus. App switching and multitasking is a breeze on both of these devices. As I've said earlier, it's very hard to pick a winner based on the real-life performance. Now let's take a look at the cameras. With the P20 Pro, we are getting an f1.8 40MP RGB sensor, f1.6 20MP monochrome sensor, and an f2.4 8MP telephoto lens. And among these three lenses, only the telephoto lens is optically stabilized, whereas the remaining two sensors use AI stabilization. Now onto the iPhone 8 Plus, we have a dual camera setup with a f1.8 12MP wide-angle sensor and a f2.8 12MP telephoto lens that allows 2x optical zoom. Only the wide-angle lens is optically stabilized, whereas there is no stabilization on that second telephoto lens. Now we'll look at some photo samples from these devices and compare them side by side. Starting off with this one, right off the bat we can see some clear differences regarding the exposure. The clouds are well detailed in the iPhone 8 Plus, whereas it's not quite clear on the P20 Pro. However, this blue board looks much more detailed on the P20 Pro than the 8 Plus, except that the pavement has more details and better color profile on the P20 Pro than the 8 Plus. And overall, both of these pictures look good, but the one shot with the P20 Pro is more appealing. Now, we'll look at the same image, but this time we're using the zoom option on both of these devices. This one is shot at 3x zoom on both the phones, and you can clearly notice the noise level creeping up on the 8 Plus, whereas the picture on the P20 Pro keeps it under control and has better detail and overall quality. Moving on to a brighter environment in this next picture here, we can notice that the image is more brighter on the iPhone 8 Plus than the P20 Pro, but there's a hint of overexposure as the highlights look slightly blown out on the 8 Plus. Also, if you zoom in, we can see that there's more noise on the picture taken with the 8 Plus. On the other hand, the P20 Pro manages the highlights really well and has controlled amount of noise on the background. So hands down, the P20 Pro has a better quality in this picture. Additionally, the zoom option on the P20 Pro beats the zoom option on the 8 Plus easily. Similarly, if you look at this next image, the clouds appear more appealing on the 8 Plus, but the P20 Pro captures more details of the building. These pictures are quite identical, but the image from 8 Plus has slightly more darker color compared to the P20 Pro, and I think there's no definite winner in this picture. Moving on to this next picture, there's a slight hint of yellowish tint on the iPhone 8 Plus, whereas the P20 Pro captures more natural image. On overall, this picture looks better on the P20 Pro with more detail and more accurate colors. Now moving on to this indoor picture, the one shot on the P20 Pro is clearly better. It has less noise and better detail than the one shot on the 8 Plus. Now let's get into some night photos. In this first picture, the P20 Pro has a much superior image quality than the 8 Plus. There's more detail and has controlled noise on the P20 Pro. Also, the highlights from the bulbs have been handled well by the P20 Pro. On the other side, the image shot from the 8 Plus looks really dull. The P20 Pro leaves the 8 Plus far behind in this setting. Similar is the story with these next pictures. You can see that the 8 Plus cannot handle the noise level and the highlights are also not well handled by the 8 Plus. P20 Pro is just amazing when it comes to low light or night conditions, and with the night mode, P20 Pro blows out its competitions. Now moving on to the video, we have a 4K option on both of these devices, but you do not get the 4K 60 FPS option on the P20 Pro, and there's no stabilization as well. Whereas you get 4K 60 FPS option on the 8 Plus with stabilization. You can see that the video is smooth and stabilized on the 8 Plus, but the video on the P20 is shaky as it lacks stabilization. Now onto the slow-mo, we have 960 FPS at 720p option on the P20 Pro, which is not available on the 8 Plus. Additionally, we have 120 FPS and 240 FPS at 1080p slow motion option on the P20 Pro as well. However, 8 Plus offers 240 FPS and 120 FPS at 1080p slow motion feature. Slow-mo is certainly better on the P20 Pro. Onto the front camera, both have pretty much a similar field of view, but they do have a different color profile. The one on the P20 Pro has a lighter color profile, whereas the one on the 8 Plus has a slightly more darker color profile. So it's a matter of personal preference. Both of these phones offers you excellent pro mode if you are feeling that extra adventurous. Likewise, panorama, time-lapse, portrait are some of the other common features available. However, P20 Pro has furthermore options like 3D panorama, light painting, and so on. So overall, I do prefer the camera on the P20 Pro than the 8 Plus. It gives you more natural color, more dynamic range, and the 8 Plus cannot really compete against it in low light conditions and night conditions. Also, the P20 Pro lets you capture what you're trying to capture. There's no more tuning to it, so it's an obvious win for the P20 Pro. Moving on to the audio, as you guys might know, we no longer have a headphone jack on the Huawei P20 Pro, but the good thing is we do have a stereo speaker on the P20 Pro. Similar is the case with the iPhone 8 Plus, but Huawei provides a USB-C to 3.5mm adapter in the box, whereas we'll have to buy it separately in case of the iPhone 8 Plus. Talking about the sheer audio quality, the speaker on the 8 Plus sounds slightly better than the P20 Pro. Onto the security, we have a fingerprint scanner on the front screen on both devices. There's no splitting between these two, both of these are equally fast and accurate. Now onto the battery, the Huawei P20 Pro has a 4000 mAh battery compared to the 2691 mAh battery on the iPhone 8 Plus. The battery life on the Huawei P20 Pro is just amazing. It will last you more than a day easily. Even under heavy uses, while I was playing PUBG for more than 2 hours, I was easily able to make it last through the whole day. On the other hand, the iPhone 8 Plus will last you a day easily, but will not beat the endurance level of the P20 Pro. In terms of charging, both of these devices support fast charging, but Apple doesn't provide the fast charger in the box. You'll have to buy it separately to enjoy the fast charging. Also, the P20 Pro charges much faster than the 8 Plus. So there you have it guys, the P20 Pro versus the 8 Plus. Looking at the price tag of both of these phones, it's better to go for the P20 Pro than the 8 Plus. You're getting a super camera, super battery life, and absolutely beautiful design. What do you guys think about both of these phones? Do let us know in the comments below, and I hope you guys like the video. See you until next time.